Well, good afternoon. How are you? My name is Danilo Petranovic, and I work here at the Abigail Adams Institute. The Abigail Adams Institute is an independent scholarly institute located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Our mission is to fortify and foster liberal arts education at Harvard and in the wider community of Boston area colleges and universities. In all our programming, we strive to model the virtues of intellectual friendship, civility, and free discourse. Our approach is designed, above all, to open students to the value of deep and broad thinking and to stimulate the spirit of intellectual adventure. This particular program, the Scholars Workshop, is designed for scholars, young and old alike, to present their current intellectual projects and to receive feedback from peers and friends and others. Today, I'm delighted to welcome our research fellow, Dr. David Franks, who will present his paper on Voegelin. J. David Franks received his PhD in systematic theology from Boston College and was professor of sacred theology for almost a decade at St. John Seminary, where he co-founded the Theological Institute for the New Evangelization and its catechetical certificate program. An activist as well as an intellectual, David serves as chairman of the board for Massachusetts Citizens for Life, founding and directing its Lincoln Forum for Human Dignity, which advances a liberal arts and high culture approach to reigniting civic conversation. David is also a doting and devoted father of 6 children. I should also say David is a convener of our Great Conversation series, which meets Wednesdays at 6:30 Eastern, and in the Zoom era, it is open to all. Perhaps you will join us. Tomorrow night, David is hosting or leading a module on Karl Marx's The Jewish Question. Okay, before I turn to David, just a couple of logistic notes. He will go on for about 10 or 15 minutes, introduce his paper, what he's trying to do with it, and then David will run the conversation and ask questions or mute and unmute people and explain how everything will work. We have a hard stop at 1:30, so it's just over an hour. Okay, with that, thank you again for joining us. And David, welcome back.
Thank you, Danilo, and thank you all for being here. It's great to see you all. And here we are on the edge of Lent. It's a good way to celebrate Mardi Gras, I hope. Hopefully there will be some fireworks. It is my hope indeed to get vigorous feedback from you all. This is a return to Voegelin for me in a serious way after having not dipped into him since actually it was after my sophomore or junior year in college. During the summer, I read Order and History. That summer I was reading a lot of Faulkner, and it was funny because those two writers have a way of getting into your writing style, and it was hard for me not to write philosophically in a way that sounded like Voegelin and literarily like Faulkner. I fell in love with Order and History, and I think it's shaped me in ways that it's still hard to track, and it's worth in that anamnetic way that he talks about to do that. One way that this is showing up, I hope there's that little poem I put in a footnote at the end of the paper, which I look back at it and I think this is Voegelin, you know. And I say that because, of course, I have criticisms to make of Voegelin in this paper, but they're criticisms made from a person who's deeply devoted to his work. So, at the time I first read Voegelin, I was an aspiring philosopher. I was not a Catholic. I've since become a Catholic. So I read it from a different existential position than I come at it now. Now I have, a lot of life has gone by, but as a theologian, I appreciate Voegelin's critiques, heavy-duty critique of theology as a historical enterprise, because I see it that there's a lot of blindness, there's a lot of ossification of concepts, a lot of playing with with words and not with realities. So that all of that is not something I react against allergically. What I have more difficulty with is any attempt to foreclose on the possibility of dogmatic formulations as being revelatory of ultimate reality. And that is where I'm trying to make a distinction between the inevitable derailments that happen within the academic enterprise, and certainly with theology, and a living faith that has been embodied in a community for 2 millennia. So that's one aspect that I would like to have on the table there. That said, I don't mind being, I want to be pushed on even that point. So as I was looking at this paper again, which consumed me for 6 weeks, this is all I ate and slept. This Voegelin, and it was wonderful, but it was also very, very difficult. But I would like to hear from you all whether there's a proportion to the whole here. I mean, I had originally planned the project to involve a longer set of coordinations between the work of Johann Baptist Metz and Voegelin. I just ran out of space. I'm up against the word limit as is, and that was a sadness to me, because I think there are things in Metz's devotion to the memory of the victims that could easily be coordinated with the parousia of the beyond that Voegelin talks about. That is this, and indeed Metz's love of the apocalyptic consciousness, which Voegelin obviously has very deep criticisms of, that the presence of the beyond is exactly what Metz means by apocalypse, and it would have been nice to be able to trace that out more fully, but there are the empirical limitations one has. In the course of this paper, it came to mind, it kind of showed itself that there were 2 stratifications that I think are not adequately performed in Voegelin. One is the stratification of the beyond, that is, and I go into why it is that he won't let himself be able to say, entertain the symbol. It's not exactly a symbol in his meaning, but if one believes in the Trinity, that would be a way of understanding the beyond in a more specific manner than the ground of divine flux or whatever. And then there's the stratification of the cosmos. And I find this is more difficult because as a problem for Voegelin. And here I'd like to know if I'm missing something, because there's the fact that the cosmic process involves generation and corruption. That's just life. But then there's the overlay, which obviously Christians account for by the fall, of not only generation and corruption, but the rhythms of sin and reconciliation. And that worldliness, which is both the fact of the vanity of temporal existence on top, is overlaid therefore with the horrors of a misuse of free will. And I'm not sure that Voegelin adequately distinguishes between the concupiscence and the perishing desires that are natural, for instance. So that seems to me an issue that is worth pursuing, and I didn't get to follow up as deeply as I wanted to in the paper. One other general question. I think that Voegelin's basic appeal to us to not treat the great texts as if they are language games, as if they are concepts to be moved around on a board, but we should penetrate through those words to those symbols, to the experiences that gave rise to them. That seems to me true, but it seems also to me that it's not exactly easy to have the same experience that another person has, and that would give pause to me in trying to claim that. So, for instance, his readings of the Timaeus, to which Plato's Timaeus, to which he returns all the time, I find very plausible. In fact, I find it convincing. But do I know that by penetrating the works, the words of an author, that I've gotten to the same experience that that author's experienced? I know as a writer myself that in fact, there's all kinds of contingencies that get into what you actually end up writing in this paper or in a poem or anything. There's all kinds of brute factors that constrain how it is that you're putting the words down that you're putting down. Those words can be meaningful. They can be luminous. They can actually reveal all kinds of things. But do they get at where you are at any particular moment? I think I've written enough to have had experience to say that we capture not as much as we hope to when we write. And that seems to me an important qualification for Voegelin's goal, which it has to be done. We can't just leave words on the page as if they are to be reported on in a history of ideas. But is it easy? Is it really possible for us to inhabit the experience that another person's had? Maybe we can overlap, but it's we don't even know though how to measure that, the degree of the overlap. So those are some of the thoughts that are in my mind. I hope that you all will have a lot of criticisms and observations to make of the paper, because I am kind of new at this. Before spending more time with activism, I was at a seminary teaching, and I actually had no tenure clock. So this is actually the first paper I'm writing for a peer-reviewed journal. So this is something I'm asking help for from those who have much more experience in this. And so thank you all for being here. Oh, yes, please kind of chime in whenever you want. I think the group is intimate enough for that to work.
So I wanted to ask a question, just sort of a terminology question.
Yes, please.
So the word theology, I think it's Plato's word in a way. It just simply means talk about God. And I've often heard this about Voegelin. His conception of philosophy is broader than, say, faith and reason being really separate, right? His philosophy always includes experience of the transcendent. So what do you mean in this paper when you say theology? I'm sure it has something to do with dogma, but go ahead.
Right. So the way Voegelin uses the word generally is to describe the historical enterprise that arose in the ecumenic age. He talks about Philo, but that's kind of a side. And then he talks about the church fathers as uniting the noetic insights of the philosophers with it's a little tricky here, but with the vision of the resurrected. So the Christian revelation. And so generally he will call theology that what we usually think of as the Christian enterprise to safeguard these pneumatic insights in his terminology, right? Now, you're right, and I play with this in the paper. In fact, his big criticism of that historic enterprise is that the classical philosophical notion of nous, of mind, which cannot be reduced to natural reason. So his criticism of, say, the scholastics is of Aquinas, actually very, very strongly, is to say, if you take natural reason as if it is a secularized reality, as if it is something that only deals with the natural intelligibilities of this world, closes it to the transcendent ground, then what you've done is you've betrayed the full amplitude of what nous or mind really is, or reason. I mean, for him, reason is something that is in fact revelatory. It's one of the sensoria through which the divine flux emerges into consciousness and therefore into history. So you're right that in our terminology, philosophy is very theological. But herein lies part of the issue. Those of us who are trained as theologians will look, and he, of course, he has all kinds of ways of saying, don't do this to me. And part of that's fair. But in his chapter in the Ecumenic Age on Paul's vision of the resurrected, he says, I can't be judged in terms of whether I'm taking a stand in the dogmatiques, the fights about dogma. But any theologian could look and say there's a definite liberal Protestant tendency in his theology if you cash it out. Now, he'll say you can't cash it out. That's something we could talk about. But that is, if theology, if one says that openness to the transcendent is theological, and in some general sense that is true, in Christian theology that's been differentiated. There's a stratification here. There's a stratification between that which bears on the one, and that's which bears on the Trinitarian God, de Deo Trino. One is accessible to natural reason. So there's that still, and this is true, that in Aquinas, it's not actually a closure of reason to the divine as such. The divine is open to reason, has to be, in fact, but only as the one God. Natural reason isn't capable of attaining to the triune, the Trinitarian God. So that now Voegelin's not interested in talking about the divine flux in those terms, right? But I am. Yes, Robert.
Yeah, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for sharing this with us, because I think this is a very important question, especially to be dealing with right now, because I've been noticing more and more in Pope Francis, trying to understand Pope Francis's magisterium, that there are a lot of things there that resonate very strongly with Voegelin that I'm extremely sympathetic to for that reason, that are going along this line of that the faith can't be turned into an ideology. You have to get around this ossification of concepts and everything. This whole critique of Gnosticism that shows up in a number of the documents. But in Voegelin, this ends up leading to that you can't have doctrine at all. And there has to be a way of articulating that in a way where you preserve what Voegelin is going at, which is super important in our moment of trying to deal with the unwinding of modernity, but not throwing everything out, like it seems like he at some points ends up doing. So to that end, I actually would be really interested in seeing more material in the later part, right before you get to the discussion of Metz. And I obviously there's probably not room in this paper, but some of these gestures at how the second person perspective or the interpersonal encounter is something that is a sort of subject-object relation. It is something that has a definite objective content in a sense that Voegelin seems not able to deal with in his move against objectification, but that is clearly more profound than just scientific rationality. And so I really like that part and the link with the Trinity there. And yeah, I hope to think or talk or see more about that move.
Okay, that's very, very helpful for me. So 2 points I want to respond to. Yes, with Pope Francis, we have a very strong pushback against the tendency for theologians to deal in concepts that are divorced from life, and it's true. It's just it's an academic difficulty. It's an occupational hazard of being an intellectual. So that something Voegelin should be read by every intellectualist, because we all have to deal with this spiritual disease, right? So that's crucial. But you're right. I think it's not an either or. Why would it be the case that on the one hand, to have a dogma is a temptation to using it as a tool to maintain hegemony over university, that the way theologians did for centuries, right? Or over society, and that's true. I mean, that there's this. There is a Catholic concupiscential imperialism that in fact uses theology as its means of control. And I know this from the inside, and I know it's true. And it is something that has to be broken. But why would that therefore disprove the reality of the Trinity? I mean, that doesn't seem to follow at all. And then that ties into the second point, though, because there is a reason why Voegelin will not admit the possibility of a further stratification of the beyond. And I think that has to do with his philosophy of consciousness that says, because of his rejection of his Husserlian intentionality as being the model for consciousness, right? That to take as the account of consciousness as I have an experience of an object, right? The constitution of subject and object, which follows from, in the end, from Kant, right? That the constitution of subject and object, that correlate is a secondary phenomenon. It's constructed. Okay, and I think there's something to that. And then to say, well, is consciousness just that? No, of course, consciousness is much richer. It's something that you would have to do your anamnetic meditation, to think about the experiences of your life, have a mystical encounter with reality as it's showing up in your life, to really get a sense of the scope of consciousness. I think that's all absolutely true. But then beyond that, and there's where that differentiation would have to continue, is it not the case that beyond the model of sense objectivity, of sense perception, we have a sense of a radical otherness? So this would be a differentiation of otherness, and otherness that isn't because of subject-object differentiation. It's because of this transcendence of the other, of alterity, whatever. Now, for a Catholic theologian, that's to tie that into the Trinity is pretty easy, right? To say that there's the one and not, there's the Father, who's not the Son, who's not the Holy Spirit, that opposition, as it were, is not a limiting opposition, but in fact gets at this is the root of our experience of the other person whom, say, we love, as being not me, as being beyond, right? And I think that's, in fact, that's in Plato. That's one of the, when people criticize Plato's epistemology in favor of Aristotle, they'll say, well, Aristotle has the union of the knower and the known. Plato still has this opposition between the one and the participant. Well, that's the kind of alterity, that otherness, that I would like to have recognized in our project. Yes, Nick.
Hello, I'm actually going to, I think, jump in on Bobby's point as well, maybe in a slightly different direction, because it's something that confuses me. And so it's a very simple question, but it's maybe, I mean, I hope it's more, it allows for a more profound response than a simple question. But when I read Voegelin, I don't grasp how his critique of scholasticism doesn't just collapse into the kind of criticism that liberal Protestantism offers. It seems like the kinds of premises that he's proposing, and the suspicion of the nature-grace dichotomy, and the suspicion of articulating dogma comes ultimately from that core, and then therefore has the same problems that liberal Protestantism culminates in. So maybe you can clarify that naive inquiry of mine for me.
Well, it's not naive. I sense it too. And again, I'm happy to get pushback from others who know Voegelin better, or maybe understand this point better. But for me, at first, I mean, there was the initial overwhelming experience of order and history when I read it decades ago, but I've returned to him over the years. And of course, there's the anti-Gnostic Voegelin that's so dear to conservatives, right? And there he's very much hammering Hegel all the time, right? Hegel's and that's affected me over the years in having started from a position of very deep skepticism about Hegel. And there's all kinds of reasons to have that skepticism. But in fact, the more I read Hegel, the more I find in him that's valuable on the one hand. On the other hand, in the end, how he stands to religion and theology reveals where his deficiencies are. And I don't, as you have just said, I don't see that he's that far from Hegel when it comes to. So what Hegel says about religion is one of the three absolute activities: art, religion, philosophy. Right? Same content, same. It's still the absolute in all three. Philosophy is still the highest, right? But he's not willing to get rid of religion. So this is part of why Hegel was still able to be maintained as a hero for both right and left, right? And then that was political landscape after the French Revolution, right and left, literally from the National Assembly, right? The right or old Hegelians seized on the part of Hegel that would not give up the religious forms and the theological words, right? He was Trinitarian in an obvious, kind of obsessive way. He was Trinitarian over against Schleiermacher, right? As the great proponent of liberal Protestantism. But in fact, it's Hegel's version of liberal Protestantism that is the most powerful, but also the one I think that shows the ultimate vacuity of the enterprise. Because not only did right Hegelianism die out within a few decades, and it was the left, or the young Hegelian version that survived, the one that said, what's vital in Hegel cannot be reconciled with the Berlin Hegel that wanted to keep preaching about the symbols of religion. Right? What's vital in Hegel is this process. Now, the difference, of course, between Hegel and Voegelin is that, and this reminds us of that quip by Kierkegaard. As Kierkegaard said, I think it was the Science of Logic, he was saying, if Hegel had written this system and then had prefaced it by saying this is all a thought experiment, it's provisional, then he would have been the greatest genius of all time, and that's probably right. And that's the part that Voegelin is very clear about Hegel's deficiency, and being so sure and being able to lay it all out. But I do see a deep similarity between Hegel and Voegelin with regard to the picture thinking of religion, that I think they both find it objectionable as a way of foreclosing on the noetic imperative, the ability of nous to be able to keep what? In Vogelin's case, the point is for the noetic to keep the sensorium of transcendence open. So that's different from Hegel, very different. But it's still that noesis, that the philosophical has to be on top, because otherwise the theologians are just going to keep dogmatizing. And it's not as if I don't understand why Voegelin would have that fear. I mean, it's been proven over and over again, but I still don't see that proves the supremacy of philosophy. Or anyone. You should feel free to just jump in at any point.
There, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi. I just was sort of listening in. It's been a while since I've studied Voegelin, but I flirted with him. And I've recently retired as a high school teacher. So some of the things that I found just in the initial presentation here is, I think we have to be careful of Voegelin's language. When you throw out, for example, terms like nous, as if it, like the way that we might approach nous, as you talk about from an existential point of view, is from the I. And again, this is problematic because in Voegelin, there's a sense in which the I is formed by what is non-objective, that transcendence in which you were speaking of early. And consciousness becomes a certain kind of paradox in Voegelin's thought. Mm-hmm. So we can raise the question, for example, what is it to be conscious? And if we're looking at it from an existential I, a problem emerges in approaching Voegelin. Similar, if you look at nous as something that we speak about in terms of our reason, we're missing that formative aspect of love, which is central in Voegelin to the formation of virtues within the psyche, the sensorium. that has this reciprocal relationship between the divine ground, as Voegelin uses that language, and what we experience in that presence, in things that actually have to be understood in a non-objective way. So language is very difficult in Voegelin, and it takes years to actually penetrate it. I just like, from my standpoint, in what's initially been said, I think we have to be careful when we speak about the I, existentialism, because it's not exactly how Voegelin uses it. I think there's one point, I remember some statement, around the word ego, which I'm not making that equivalent to the word I, that there were no egos before the 17th century. And I think Voegelin makes that statement somewhere. And just about, just a brief thought about Hegel, like Voegelin makes clear the end of history isn't here. So how can we know its meaning, from an eschatological point of view? Anyway, sorry, I was just rambling there.
No, your point is very well taken. I think it's very, very important to emphasize the fluctuating nature of the self, or whatever you want to call it, in Voegelin, and that's part of the point. Is in fact the evanescence of our consciousness, or it's it's fluctuation, because in the end, when the event of theophany occurs, there's a merging, right? There's a one and anotherness of that event that does not allow one to keep oneself as private property, and that's something he very much emphasizes, and I fully acknowledge that. So I think that's beautiful. That mystical union is beautiful. The issue, though, is whether one can maintain. Whether mysticism requires us to say that the one and the other are not to be able to be seen as still maintaining a kind of difference. That is, can there be unity without difference? Can there be a so even if we're talking about non-dual metaphysics, an account of reality that's non-dual, is it still not the case that one would want to say that for love to occur, there must be a one and another? So that would be part of my general thought there. And I forget how you ended your reflections, but no, I think it's very important for us to recognize that, in fact, that when Voegelin talks about, for instance, the modern dispensation as egophanic, he is already talking about a deformation in how we experience ourselves. So you're right to point all of that out.
Yep. But we experience ourselves in a kind of strange mystery. Like if you take his analysis of the agathon and, breaking the chains within the cave, there is a sense in which that revelatory love, I think 492C in the Republic is really quite good that way, in which we are turned. That is the word Perugia, or is that presence? Yeah. So I mean, there's that turning in which the I kind of disappears, as we move towards, what reality is, that divine, non-objective reality. And love, in a certain sense, is not one or the other. It's something that's transforming. It's a putting together. It's a harmonizing. And this I see as being central to understanding philosophy and its balance of religion, which I think Voegelin talks about in many places. But it's that objective piece, one and the other, that I find problematic. I like the idea of like a reciprocal relationship. I mean, we're not our own in a certain sense in Voegelin. And that turning kind of takes away the I of us.
David, may I interject and ask a question for you? I wonder if you can take us to your section 6, Paul's derangement, and walk us through that. I found it the most intriguing part of your paper, as I assume many others have as well. And, where Voegelin judges, Plato succeeds, David Franks, and Paul fails, David Franks begs to differ, and why? Would you mind walking us through that? I think that would be very helpful.
So that's page 20 of the text. And he begins actually by he's carrying over Plato's achievement in maintaining the balance of consciousness, even though philosophy itself is generated by the unbalancing experience of the divine. But Plato is able to maintain, and Plato above all is able to maintain his balance because he's rooted in the primary experience of the cosmos. So he's never beyond the mythological. And this actually is a very important, I think this is a point that is very strong in Voegelin and better than some of the Christian, the theological alternatives. So, Hegel learned from Christianity and from Christian theology to demythologize the myth, to demythologize the other universal religions. Voegelin would preserve the truth of myth, and he thinks he's following Plato in doing that. And I think that's correct, and I think that's something that Christian theology has to learn from. That is, so I think Voegelin's completely correct that if one says, well, the differentiation of consciousness simply renders all that came before false, you're going to cut yourself off from the reality that has to endure. Okay, so what Voegelin sees in Plato is a preservation of that grounding, and what he sees in Paul is a cutting free of that grounding, and that for him is a matter of pathological apocalypticism. And so that's what that quote on 20, I won't read that full quote, but if one believes that there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth, that is, if one understands the meaning of salvation to be life beyond death, and if one thinks that this is an eventuality that's there, and this I do need help with, because it's not clear to me why, if Voegelin does know, and he does, he knows that the process of reality is itself transcending itself, as he says, has an eschatological direction. Why is it the case that it would be problematic for Paul to live in the presence of that impending end? That doesn't seem to me to be obviously unbalanced. But I raise a few questions here. This passage gives me a chance to question Voegelin on apocalyptic. Again, Voegelin was depending on monographs of his day, and the literature on apocalyptic has shifted a lot since then, and to the good. We understand it better, I think. And this is a fight that theologians in the debate between those who are more given to the historical critical method as setting the theological agenda, and those who believe that dogma has more of an upper hand. The question is, can the simple faith of a believer be dependent upon the next monograph that comes out, right? I mean, that's you say it and it sounds absurd, and it is. So that's one difficulty I have with the that is, there's some other reality going on here that one has to take seriously. The second question I raise, this is on page 22. Well, this all has to do with his Voegelin's very harsh criticism of Isaiah as being indulging in a metastatic magic, in advising, it seems, King Ahaz to just trust in God, and supposedly meaning, therefore, don't take any pragmatic steps to resist the Syrians and the Ephraimites. Well, again, I question a lot of things in that scenario, but it seems to me that, do we believe that prophets can be the conduits of a practical, of a counsel that would actually be effective in one's life? That would be one of my questions. And so on. So this is where I go into the stratification of, I think, beyond in terms of the Trinity. And I could have spent a much longer, again, I was against the word limit. It would take several more chapters to to spin out everything in the chapter on Paul's vision of the resurrected, but that puts some of the things on the table. Veronica, and then David Wall.
Hi, thank you for this paper. I don't know much about a lot of Voegelin. I've only read a few things. So my question, forgive me if it's misguided, but I'm wondering about so this concept of theophany and then the historiogenesis and how they relate to history. So I thought that the stuff about historiogenesis was really interesting in that it seems like an attempt to rationalize or create a narrative that you might call something like myth making, but then theophany you say, or Voegelin says, gives meaning to history. So are they sort of opposed? Is one like myth making in the bad sense and the other is an illumination of the true meaning of history, or how do you think about those two things when it comes to making sense of meaning? And
oh, that's a really great question. First, it's great to see you. So Voegelin's concern with historiogenesis is that it's an imposition on the facts of history in order to secure a kind of stability for one's current society, right? So Hegel's account would be classic in a way, but Voegelin goes all the way back to the pre ecumenic empires and says this is a constant recourse we have to try to stabilize our position in history by recounting the facts of history in a way that make everything lead up to us. Okay, so that would not be the good kind of myth making for him because I think it would be fair to say, because it is not allowing the abundance of the transcendent ground to reveal itself, but in fact, we're trying to force reality into our own project. So again, the big shift for Voegelin, and this has to do with his account of consciousness, the point is to get that reversal, that we're not the ones intending, we're the ones intended. And that's very, so if we're driving the narrative, then we've perverted the process of revelation. David Walsh, I'm thrilled to have a scholar I admire so much to pop in on this.
Well, thanks very much for your lovely paper, and I'm happy just to make a remark or two.
Please.
I was very much taken by your wrestling with apocalypse and all of that in Voegelin, and because it's something I've wrestled with myself over the years, and especially that chapter on the Pauline vision of the resurrected, which gave many of Voegelin's Christian followers a fair amount of heartburn. And a small bit of disappointment over the years, because it seemed to be the occasion when he was going to launch into the Christian texts and then sort of sideswipe them on the way out. So, and actually, whenever we had a chance to bring this up to him, he would always say, "Well, you guys go and do it then. You weren't happy with his account, you do it. You complete it." Yeah. It was never, it was never something that he was defensive about. Everything was, as long as you could inform him a little better, he'd be very happy with the outcome. One of the things that has struck me over the years is that Voegelin himself, in his reading of these texts, and especially in his treatment of apocalypse and Christianity, avoided one of the paths that he had opened to himself very early on. And this is where your discussion of the self and the other comes in. In the 30s, Voegelin seemed to be really exposing himself quite a bit to the kind of personalist literature that was going around, even with people like Gilles Son and so on, and the French thinkers broadly. Afterwards, I think probably when he came to America and got a commission to write a history of political ideas, that kind of absorbed him for about 10 or 15 years. And so it seemed to be less necessary to find his own kind of satisfactory language of that. And then it was only much later he returns to order and history to launch into a new beginning. But it has always struck me that his early writings, the stuff that he brought out in Anamnesis, the letter to Schutz and things of this nature, where he's talking about how the self and others is not really something, or the transcendence of the self and others, this is not something you need to demonstrate or to validate or prove. You begin with it as a presupposition. And that was all very effective, I thought. But really, in some sense, the thinking about these issues has moved further, especially through someone like Levinas, that the other is closer to me than I am to myself. That's a really arresting formulation. And you begin to see, of course, it's not just a presupposition. It's not just a presumption that we begin with, that we transcend towards others, but that we begin with that. That's kind of the raw material from which we begin. We know one another in this immediate way without really knowing at the same time. So, you know, I think there's a whole other way into many of these questions. Apocalypse itself is a kind of revelation of the other that, you know, has that capacity to arrest time. You know, it's a judgment, it's a crisis, it's all of these things. And, you know, there's many other ways in which Voegelin's work can be, you could say, drawn out, I think, along those lines. That's just I thought listening to you speak about it, but thanks for the good work there.
Well, I'm honored to have this very, very powerful thoughts you have presented here. Levinas is very important for me also. So I think, yeah, that's the name to use in the end. If one wants to put forward a sense that there's irreducibility that constitutes, so beyond the secondary fact of intentionality setting up all kinds of divisions in the world, there's the fact that we are constituted by an otherness, right? And continue to be constituted by otherness. And that's in Christian dogmatics, of course, and that was actually the other point David Bourne was referring to. The Trinity, which I don't treat simply as a symbol in the colloquial sense, but the Spirit is the one that traverses the one and the other, right? And that's the Spirit of love is what does that. And as a Catholic systematician, I find it overwhelmingly illuminating for my own experience to have the Trinity as the root reality in all kinds of ways. This is something that I find not an imposition on reality, but something that actually explains it from the inside. As far as apocalypse, Metz and Benjamin, they move me so deeply because of their devotion to apocalypse. And again, as I mentioned briefly, I think before you got on, when Voegelin talks about the parousia of beyond, that seems to me a very clear place where, and I didn't get to do it in the paper, but that's the kind of apocalyptic presence that, in fact, Metz talks about. So there's a clear way to try to bring it together. I think it's largely a terminological difficulty, I think, I hope anyway, because I love all of these thinkers so much. And one other thing, Dr. Walsh, when I was drawing this story of the ecumenic age as being in fundamental continuity with modernity, when I read at the beginning of The Growth of the Liberal Soul that you've got the same continuity, but you've reversed the valuation. In fact, there's a positive differentiation into modernity. That seemed like a revelation to me. That seemed right in all kinds of ways. And it seems to me exactly the kind of way to use Voegelin's thought without being a mere disciple. That is, it's a way of actually taking his thought as a vital way of approaching reality. So I'm just thrilled that you're here.
Thank you that you noticed that. Noticed it. I can tell you that when I published The Growth of the Liberal Soul, many of my Voegelin friends walked no more with me. because the one thing that all of those scholars from the mid-20th century that came through the totalitarian experience were convinced of was that liberal democracy was a halfway house towards where they had been.
Right. As well.
So it was just extraordinarily difficult, I think, for them to see it as, not a kind of ultimate symbolism, but as a kind of set of abbreviations that managed to evoke really an authentically decent form of political life.
Hmm. Yeah, I asked, did Voegelin go to church on Sunday?
No. When people asked him that question, he would say, well, he was a pre-Reformation Christian, or any of those things. Obviously, Voegelin did meditate. He had his own spiritual life, but he stayed out. And again, I think a lot of it is attributable to his hard personal experiences. If you read Hitler and the Germans, you see, yes, the churches, they were like one of the worst places to look for succor, help, guidance, or anything. When the chips were down, they were nowhere to be seen.
Well, I know that to be, it's true, and it's a scandal, and I understand. Yes.
Yeah. So it would have taken a little bit, probably more of a charitable outlook than Voegelin had for these things.
Right.
Okay. So again, and then I think liberal democracy got tarred by some of the same brush. Strauss had the same view. Strauss had the same view that it might work in some places, but it was nothing you could rely on.
Well, I'm afraid that's not improved that much in the years since. So that's the great scandal, of course. I do believe, as a Catholic, I believe this is the true religion, but my goodness, we do not give much empirical evidence of that.
Yeah. Well, certainly the Catholic Church held the same view for a very long time too, especially from the French Revolution onwards, that individualism and liberalism and what they refer to as Americanism were all very, very bad news.
Right.
And even the significance of Dignitatis Humanae at the Second Vatican Council, that really puts forward religious liberty as the first liberty, that was something of a new dispensation. Not completely new, not completely unheard of in the Gospels or even St. Augustine or St. Thomas, but in terms of the kind of conventional self-understanding and worldview, it was the Catholic Church after the First Vatican Council had a kind of fortress mentality, and then all of a sudden it's thrown open. So, and even the embrace of human rights, the language of human rights, that was a novelty too.
Right.
Those are, but that none of that, having a set of abbreviations that's evocative doesn't solve political problems. It's a beginning for those who want to step up, I think, and sustain and support them.
Well, what's your revaluation of the differentiation of modernity helps me to see is that, in fact, if we want to look at the history of the world since the ecumenic age as a history of the contest of those who could fly the banner of ecumenic consciousness, the consciousness of universal humanity most plausibly, it really is liberalism broadly conceived that has had the most adherence and has the most effect on our lives beyond even Christianity, right? So I like to think of that system as rooted in Christianity, but it is what it is. That this is what if that's going to be a standard, what has been able to evince ecumenic consciousness or to realize ecumenic consciousness most with the most amplitude? Well, liberal democracy seems to be a really good contender for that.
And the notion that underpins it, which is that each human being is an inexhaustible source of meaning and value in the universe, and that the whole universe revolves around each one. Each one is of inestimable significance. That's certainly a modern formulation, if not a modern discovery. It's not a modern discovery. I mean, St. Augustine says God would have created us even if we were to be the only. If I was to be the only one, he said, each of us as if we were the only one to be there. So that's a kind of valuation of the singular person that is not well mirrored anywhere else. It's not absent in terms of its resonances, I think, in the classical world or in the world of the other great world religions. But it's given a kind of identity and political coherence in the language of liberal political principles and everything that flows from that, including the Universal Declaration. And we're still struggling with the problem of the issue of how we understand it, how we conceptualize it, how we conceptualize the roots, the foundations, and so on. The UN Universal Declaration worked because everybody avoided that question. But it can't be avoided forever.
Well, yeah, I think there's a definite political question for political science as far as where do you get the substantial content for the personalism, but then theologically, I would want to work it into Trinity.
Yeah. Well, the Trinity, I think, is probably the ultimate theoretical framework for it. But politically, you have to work with what's available.
Right.
David, can I encourage us to go to Jim and Christopher next? Thank you. Okay.
Jim?
Unmute here. Yes. First, let me begin by thanking you, Dr. Franks, for a really wonderful paper that thrust me back into wrestling with certain aspects of Voegelin's thinking that I've long struggled with. I'm a retired English professor who spent most of his work looking at literary works that were imaginatively connected to the Bible. And I'm also a person who studied with Eric Voegelin one semester when he was at Notre Dame in 1971. And who had, there's just no question in my mind that his being in his presence was the most profound experience I had of a mentor. One way of describing was that he kind of awakened my philosophic consciousness. And I've spent a great deal of time both trying to be faithful to the insights that he gave me and to somehow escape from this enormous presence that he was in my life. What my brain is teeming with things I could say about your paper and about the discussion, but I'll try to focus in on two things. One was that what I learned to try to think in the spirit of Voegelin without becoming a dogmatic Vogelinian was his pointing out that passage from Plato's Philebus about the space of dialogue between the one and the unlimited, and the nature of the concepts that emerge in the course of our dialectic as intermediate forms. It seemed to me that what he left us with and where we are in our thinking is always needs to be kept in mind as a movement as well as an articulation of particular concepts, and that has helped me a great deal. Just to be, I mean, as a person studying a lot of literature that is related to the Bible, the Trinity, as you've talked about, is immensely important to me, and it does seem to me that if you look at the development of Trinitarian doctrine, which took hundreds of years to emerge, one way of thinking about it was that it was the earnest application of noetic reflection to the scriptures and to the hundreds of years of church communities, that led to an articulation of it. And it does seem to me, I mean, this may be oversimplifying, that one of the reasons Voegelin focused on Paul when he wound up turning to Christianity was that Paul left written documents, and so much the center of the activity had to do with being able to pick up a text and interpret it. The second comment I would offer would be on that, and it goes back to your opening comments about the difficulty of interpreting in ways that carry one back to some kind of identification with the experience of the author. And this is where I've found that, Voegelin rejected, as you mentioned in the paper, the phenomenological tradition early on, but broadly speaking, the development of the phenomenological tradition into hermeneutics and hermeneutic philosophy and the importance of people like Ricoeur and Gadamer, for me, were central, and that what we do when we, and it seems to be what Voegelin does when he interprets a text in that evocative way that brings the subject matter to life. The point there is not an identification with a consciousness, but rather a disclosure of the subject matter that concerned the consciousness, and that there remain two consciousnesses involved in that an interpretive act. And Gadamer gets at that by saying that to understand authentically is to understand differently. That someone engaging in the effort, it's not the identification with Plato's consciousness that's at stake, but it's the engagement with the same subject matter that Plato disclosed to us, and that we can evocatively experience again because of engagement with the text. So those are just a couple of comments that your paper and this discussion has elicited from me. And just in passing, I should thank David Walsh, because in trying to carry out the both the experience or the spirit of Voegelin's work and my own work, finding people like David who seem to me to do that and yet be able to look at modernity and see a positive sign in it has been an extraordinarily encouraging source for me.
Yes, David Walsh's work has been immensely important for the world. So that's very elegant what you said, and when you said the last thing that struck me with a flash. Yes, I was making the assumption. It's not in the paper, but I introduced it because I wanted to hear you all give a solution, and you did. It wasn't. You're right. It's not the experience. I was assuming Voegelin saying you've got to penetrate the symbol to get to the experience of the thinker, but you're right. It's not that. It's the experience of that metaleptic reality. Yeah, you're right. That solves that conundrum. I guess. I mean, that still. Then there's the question: how can we know that event, which still is historically
right?
Am I still having that? But we have a much greater chance of hitting that than getting into the experience of a person who's. Yeah. So thank you. That's very helpful for me. Chris, my good friend.
David, thanks for having me. This has been wonderful. I'm sorry I was a couple of minutes late. I was dealing with some stuff on the desk. I think you're quite right. I mean, for one who loves and is as greatly indebted to Voegelin as I am, and as you know I am, you touch on the crucial failure, and you don't give it the kid glove treatment. I appreciate that. It's the most profoundly unsatisfactory passage in a corpus that is I don't think I'd be exaggerating, or I'd be willing to defend the statement that it taught me everything. I mean, of course, his treatment of Paul. Just sitting here and listening to the conversation, it dawns on me that, I kept thinking of those lines in the Walgreen lectures in the New Science of Politics that, think it's there anyway, where he talks about one of the great difficulties of doing political science in the present of 1951 or 52 was that a lot of the technical terminology, the language of what passed for political theory was also alive, and although had a very different and not always reconcilable semantic valence in lived political reality. And it strikes me that he never treats this as a possibility when he turns to treat of things, like the Trinity, the eschaton in Paul. That and I think Professor Walsh was talking about this just a minute ago, that Trinitarian theology took hundreds of years to elaborate. And it certainly was noetic reflection, but it was the noetic reflection that was, being carried out by certain representative thinkers within a political community that was the church. It strikes me that one could, roughly and readily, accept his critique pretty much to core, but then turn it around on him and say that one of the things I think I noted in my notes to you was about his failure adequately to treat of the symbology of the self-interpretative symbology of Christianity as it's being the church being rooted in Israel and being the new Israel. As an extension of that community which exists in history under the divine transcendent. And then to turn around, if you're ever going to get to Metz at that point, I'm still not entirely clear on why you felt you needed him. Not that you didn't do a wonderful job with him. But to say that theologians frequently were themselves corruptors of the very noetic project of the community of which they professed to be members and were, doesn't touch the experience itself. You can push that all the way back to his treatment of Paul and say that, with the eruption of the eschaton into history as a person in history, which, puts history into permanent crisis, but doesn't eclipse history. It doesn't put Paul as a fellow who's sort of standing in the breach, right? I'd like to see you at once, in other words, give him more, and give him a little bit of rope and let him hang himself with it.
Excuse me, David, just one quick question. Why don't we get in Mario Fontini's question? Because we're coming up at the end of our allotted time here. We really want to finish at 1:30. And then you can answer both questions. But before we do any of that, I see that Lee Trepanier has joined us, and I would like to thank him very much for inviting all of these other Vogelinians into our workshop. So Lee Trepanier, thank you so much. And of course, Lee, to those of us from Abigail Adams, know him very well. 2 years ago, he led introductory seminar, Introduction to Voegelin, here at the Abigail Adams Institute with our undergraduate and graduate students, and David Franks was also present there. So in any event, okay, Mario, and then thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Danilo, but I'm not sure that was necessary. I still feel like I'm a 5-year-old trying to wield some heavy wooden or aluminum bat with Voegelinian concepts and terminology. So my comments to you, David, are primarily from the perspective of an editor. Since you opened the session as requesting or soliciting some practical advice, and I had two. I'll combine my comments very quickly. One is, and by the way, this is great. I return to Voegelin every few years and try to see how much more I understand, because I think there's something to be said for acquiring life experience and learning new things, and then going back to Voegelin, and you understand more with the passing of time. So I really appreciate what you've done here, going back, as you said, after many years. One is reflected in the paper and also in this discussion for the last hour and a quarter, we've barely touched on Metz. So why not just cut Metz out and just focus completely on Voegelin? I think that would make this really a stronger, more than it already is, paper. You can just dispense with Metz or reduce them to a footnote, but I don't think there's any need to include them in the way you have them, kind of a comparison. Just focus on Voegelin and elaborate as you've done, but more on why he, like Strauss, thinks that the philosopher is the only theologian you'll ever need. I think that would be something worth considering. Also, from an editorial perspective, and pardon me again to the other philosophers in the group, I would consider just cutting out the first paragraph entirely and just going right into it. Although I would keep the poem at the end. I think it's very useful. However, I might add some explanatory comments or something to it, tying it into your paper, if that makes any sense. But I would just dive right in with the second paragraph. Eric Voegelin was no mere theorist. There were a couple other comments, but given that there's only 2 or 3 minutes left, I think I'll stop there. I just wanted to give you very quick practical advice from an editorial point of view. Pardon me. Thank you.
No, I appreciate it, actually, and this is a good paragraph.
If I could just jump in, I'd like to say, to get on record, that there are 2 editors in this room, and both of them agree that the first paragraph should go at this point. So,
though, if anybody disagrees, I'd like to hear that. That's the poet in me wanting to start an academic paper in a non-academic way, but love to get some support. But both of you did point that out, and both of you actually made the criticism about including Metz. Part of it was that I understood the remit, and I wouldn't have written this paper without Lee. So I'm so grateful to him, and that to present Voegelin in terms of political theology. I mean, one could vaguely talk about him as a theologian or political theologian, but he's not. I mean that. So I wanted to actually deal with an example of political theology from, and there's not a lot of political philosophers that'd be able to bring Metz in. So that there was that aspect, but also, in terms of the logic of the paper, I thought it would be useful to have a theologian to present a few points to help my basic. The paper is about Voegelin, so it's to show that Voegelin, try to explicate Voegelin as a theologian of some sort, so that was the thought. But I'm happy to hear it, and maybe you all can, if you have thoughts to weigh in on to provide it to Danilo, it'd be great for me to see all of that. But no, I'm grateful, and that editors must be hard, and that's a good thing. I am so grateful for all of you for your input, for your participation. It is something that makes me very happy to be able to talk about Voegelin, and this is a very beautiful community that has popped up for this event. So I'm very grateful.